Welcome to the podcast series on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings. I am your host, Liloba Paul, UNHCR Learning Development Officer on topics related to gender-based violence. This work is brought to you by the Safe from the Start Project, a collaboration between UNHCR's Division of International Protection and the Global Learning and Development Center in Budapest. Our topic today is mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation into shelter and settlements. It is my pleasure to have with me Francesca Coloni, Shelter Cluster Coordinator in Erbil, Iraq. Welcome, Francesca.
Thank you, Liloba. It's my pleasure to be here.
Could you share with us a bit about your experience with mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in your activities as a shelter coordinator?
Sure, thank you. Well, mainstreaming protection in a broad sense must be at the core of our daily work. Even if at a first glance, shelter and CRI assistance might look far from potentially playing a crucial role in protection mainstreaming. As a shelter cluster, we have striven to build very solid approaches, including the capacity of our partners to anticipate and mitigate protection risks, and especially those related to GBV. It is not an easy task due to many underreported incidents and traditional beliefs that perpetuate discrimination against women, girls, LGBTI persons, and those with specific needs. Let's also face it, GBV is a widespread phenomenon, even in developed countries and among well-resourced societies. We have seen this even more so during the current COVID-19 pandemic and prolonged lockdown periods. As such, it cannot be really underestimated or ignored across the broadest spectrum of our daily work. Building staff capacity to understand GBV issues is essential. We have also collaborated with the Housing, Land and Property subcluster, which is led by UNHABITAT, to better understand the housing, land and property rights for women and marginalized groups, since these are the most in need of our shelter support. And jointly with other clusters, especially WASH, Camp Coordination, Camp Management, CCCM, and GBV, we have prepared a safety audit questionnaire to assess GBV risks in IDP camps. But unfortunately, this work is now on hold due to the movement restrictions because of the current pandemic.
Thank you for mentioning some of these areas of collaboration and joint activities across sectors. A safety audit is one of the approaches for identifying GBV risks endorsed at an interagency level and by UNHCR. Hopefully, conditions will improve and allow for that to take place. What are some of the challenges you faced mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation? You mentioned IDP camps since you're working predominantly in an IDP situation, yes?
Yes, that's very correct. So there are some refugees in this geographic zone, but within the shelter cluster mandate, the focus is on IDP responses as well as IDP returnees in need of shelter. So I have to say that some of the local cultures tend to be male-centered, hence they do not promote gender equality. And this has a huge impact throughout the whole humanitarian program cycle. Imagine that leaders at community level, the head of the family, tend to be male. That means that it is sometimes very difficult to hear the voices of women and girls. So respondents to assessments or monitoring programs are usually men. And it makes it very difficult for us to understand female opinions, problems, concerns, so that we can then tailor our programs based on their specific needs and preferences. Furthermore, I also want to mention the cultural stigma towards LGBTI persons, which sometimes lead to them being rejected by their family and sent out of their homes. So then we have received requests for shelter support for such cases. Furthermore, fear, trauma, and stigmatization make all these problems invisible and difficult to identify. Hence, all shelter officers should develop great acumen and understand more in depth the severe implications of not using a solid AGD approach in their programs. We should continue to provide awareness and sensitization for staff with regard to GBV and its prevention in order to help mitigate risks and empower women and girls.
Yes, it is essential to continue developing staff capacity within the shelter sector to more systematically assess and analyze GBV risks, and also to put in place measures to reduce exposure for persons at risk of GBV. Do you have an example of a promising practice you carried out?
Yes, I would like to share few examples. So first of all, many households in IDP camps are actually female-headed in Iraq, living primarily in emergency shelter, which are basically tents. So these tents need regular replacement. And thanks to the collaboration with forward-looking shelter cluster partners, ahead of the winter season last year, we have managed a large tent replacement program promoting the employment of women. So they benefited from cash for work, proving as well that an activity usually perceived as male-oriented could be actually very successfully carried out by women too. Similarly, another program aimed at providing low-cost transitional shelter solutions to IDP returnees whose houses were destroyed during the recent conflict had to prepare traditional mud bricks, and this was carried out by the women of the village. So for me, the promising practice here is to engage in a participatory and consultative process during the design phase of any shelter program and to go beyond the traditional social roles given to women and men, thinking out of the box and identify areas or activities where women can be part of the implementation of shelter programs, enhancing their participation and allowing them to earn an income. But here again, we have also to make sure that earning an income or having some cash will not generate further risks for them.
Indeed, during a shelter intervention that involves earning cash, a humanitarian perspective needs to keep in mind the do no harm approach and anticipating potential GBV risks. Thank you for mentioning that. This would be also in consultation with women and girls involved in the shelter program. What are some suggestions or advice that you would want to share with other members of the shelter workforce?
Well, what we always say in Iraq is that the devil is in the detail. So shelter experts know very well this motto because they have to work with great precision and accuracy when they deal with technical and engineering standards. So the same shall apply in anticipating potential GBV risks if a shelter is not safe enough for women, girls, but also boys, older persons, and persons with specific needs. During the assessment phase, it is crucial to have a frank dialogue with all members of the family, also hinting to some issues that might not be revealed by POCs. For instance, asking if they feel safe at home, if they have enough privacy during their daily life, if they have suggestions on how to enhance these aspects through shelter interventions. So the aim is not to simply provide a solid shelter or enough core relief items. The ultimate goal remains meeting their needs, which differ from person to person and from family to family, while balancing, of course, the need also for a standardized assistance. So understanding specific needs around what might be a simple issue could indeed allow mitigation of GBV incidents. For instance, the aspect of privacy shall be carefully assessed, even within a shelter and especially when it is shared among a large family. For instance, providing only one winter heater means that during the cold season, all family members will tend to sleep in the same single warmed-up room. And this is not ideal from an HED and GBV perspective. So if these nuances are not captured in the assessment phase, they should then be captured during the monitoring phase, and then the programs be adjusted accordingly.
Thank you for these clear suggestions. What are some resources or technical guidance you would recommend to other shelter personnel that you find useful for mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation into the shelter sector?
I would for sure recommend some global guidances. First of all, the IASC GBV guidelines and its thematic area on shelter settlement and recovery. We have, of course, the Global Shelter Cluster website with resources on protection considerations, including protection mainstreaming and mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation. Also, the constant companion for GBV with do's and don'ts to safely handle disclosure of GBV incidents. Then the UNHCR master plan approach to settlement planning and the very useful IUM and shelter cluster video on responding to disclosure of a GBV incident in various languages. And finally, we have the Global Protection Cluster and the Protection Mainstreaming website and training package. But Leloba, allow me to add that all these are valid and relevant. I still want to add some less formal resources, such as briefings with local female staff, preferably cognizant of GBV issues. And always keep an open mind. Use common sense. Going beyond what our culture might push us to assume or believe on behalf of others is always helpful and recommended.
Thank you, Francesca, for sharing your experiences with mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation and for recommending some resources in the area of shelter.
You're welcome. It was nice being here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. To all of our listeners, do tune in to the next podcast in our series from the GLDC on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings.